Hurricane Helene has finally reached the end of its life, but right behind that is another potential system that's going to be developing in the Caribbean Sea, exactly where Hurricane Helene developed last week. And over the next 6 to 7 days, we could see another tropical cyclone develop and eventually go towards the Gulf Coast of the United States, and that could become a hurricane. So we're going to be talking all about that here in just a moment. This is what's left, though, of Helene. It is now a post-tropical cyclone. It's no longer even really called a hurricane or anything like that. It is no longer named. It's just a broad area of low pressure that is remaining back over in the Ohio Valley. This unfortunately will be dumping a couple more inches of rain in some areas across the Ohio Valley and even back over in the Appalachians over the next day or two. So unfortunately, for the areas that have already seen a lot of flooding, rain is going to continue. The good news, though, is that the worst of the impacts are finally past us with Hurricane Helene. Looking at our latest National Hurricane Center outlook for the next 7 days, you'll notice it is getting very active across the Atlantic Basin. We have Hurricane Isaac, which is continuing to move to the east. Not going to be any impact really to land, but it actually did become a Category 2 hurricane yesterday, so definitely did become a little bit more intense. We also have Tropical Storm Joyce, which is expected to be a fish storm. So if you know any fish back over here in the central Atlantic Ocean, make sure to give them a call or text and make sure they're all right there. Back over further to the east, we have another area of development which will likely become our next hurricane. It will more than likely become a hurricane before this area of development does, but this one will likely really intensify quickly over the next few days as it eventually moves to the west, and then eventually it'll move off to the north, and we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. And then back over here in the Caribbean Sea and as well as the Gulf of Mexico, it all looks too familiar to what we just saw with Hurricane Helene. It is essentially the same exact area where we are expecting some development over the next 7 days. It currently has about a 50% chance of development over the next 7 days, so it's not a slam dunk forecast that we are definitely going to see a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, but I do think there is reason why you should be paying attention to this, because if it does develop, it will likely be impacting the United States sometime this upcoming weekend, and it could become again a hurricane if it's able to develop. You might remember this graphic from only about a week ago when we were talking about Hurricane Helene. This is the Central American Gyre, and essentially what this is a broad area of low pressure that's able to spin up some systems that can end up becoming hurricanes or tropical storms, mostly developing in the Western Caribbean Sea and then eventually moving into the Gulf of Mexico. Again, Helene was a system exactly like this. It started back over in the central and northwestern Caribbean Sea and then meandered through the Yucatan Channel and then obviously made landfall in the Big Bend of Florida. This system has the potential to do something similar. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see landfall in Florida if it does develop into a tropical system, but we do think areas along the Gulf Coast should be monitoring this very closely over the next few days in case it does end up developing. Although we don't have anything that's developed yet, we are going to go ahead and talk about the computer model Tua here across the Caribbean Sea and as well as the Gulf of Mexico. Let's begin with Tuesday, which is when this will likely start to form into more of a cluster of thunderstorm activity and perhaps even a low pressure center. This is the GEFS ensemble members. Again, this is a group of models essentially on one graphic that you'll kind of notice where they are currently putting intensity and perhaps the landfall area as we go into this week. So this is beginning Tuesday morning. Again, most ensemble members just with a low pressure center, really nothing more than a tropical depression by this point. As we go into Tuesday afternoon and evening, a lot of the ensemble members still remain on the lower side when it comes to intensity, but there are a couple in here that bring this to a tropical storm level as early as Tuesday afternoon in the Caribbean Sea. So that's going to be something that we need to watch for closely if it does develop by then. By Wednesday, there's still a pretty large split, I would say, in terms of intensity and also in terms of if this thing even develops, because there are still a few ensemble members that do indicate, hey, we got a tropical storm by Wednesday night still in the Northwest Caribbean Sea. On the flip side of things, there are a lot of ensemble members that barely even have a low pressure system. So again, there's really, I would still say, a 50-50 chance this even develops at this point. Once we go into Thursday, though, if this does end up developing, there are ensemble members that do continue to have this intensifying into the Gulf of Mexico by Thursday night into Friday morning. Some of them bring this to a Category 1 hurricane as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico, and still many of them in the tropical storm level. Now, you might be wondering, did Hurricane Helene, impact the environment here in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea? It did. It did obviously remove some of the heating from the water because of it mixing all the water up essentially, but it's not going to be enough necessarily to stop a tropical storm or hurricane from developing. That's something that not everybody understands. It will not stop anything from developing, but it will obviously hinder the potential for something like rapid intensification, which is something we did see with Hurricane Helene. By Friday morning into Friday afternoon, ensemble members are pretty split on location and intensity. A few of them bring this towards Florida as a Category 1 or Category 2 hurricane, and then bunch of them in the central Gulf of Mexico, anywhere between tropical storm level all the way up to a category 2 hurricane. And then by the time we go into Saturday, the models are all over the place. Some of them have it making landfall in Florida, some still have it sitting in the central Gulf of Mexico. By Sunday, they are still all over the place, basically stalled from the northwestern or southwestern Atlantic Ocean back into the central Gulf. And then even into Monday into Tuesday, there are some members that have it making landfall by next week, which would obviously be something that's a bit more of an outlier as of right now with the models, but it is a scenario that could happen. But again, at this point, we don't exactly know what's going to happen because we don't yet have a system that's developed. But this is a pretty good indicator that there is definitely a chance that something could develop, and if something does develop, we very easily could see a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico this upcoming week. Hypothetically, let's say this does develop. This is the GFS model as we go into this week. Notice how it develops into a tropical cyclone as we go into late Thursday into Friday, entering the Yucatan Channel. Here's where the concern comes in. If this is slow enough here in the Gulf of Mexico, it could intensify to a hurricane. If it's a fast-moving system, though, I don't think this gets anywhere past a tropical storm because, again, the environment's been used up by Hurricane Helene, unless this went way further to the west or something like that. But this is by the time we go into Friday night and a Saturday morning. Notice how this continues to intensify into a tropical storm and then eventually into a Category 1 hurricane, and then by Saturday night and a Sunday morning, this attempts to make landfall again somewhere along the Gulf Coast. Now, again, this is just one computer model run. The GFS model has been kind of all over the place with where it makes landfall and also the intensity, but this is a hypothetical situation that could end up happening if we do see something develop. So it is going to be something that we need to watch for very closely. Now, I do want to point out another thing. The GFS model does not have this as a very large hurricane by any means. This looks like it's going to be a relatively small hurricane compared to what we saw with Hurricane Helene. Now, again, if this becomes a hurricane, I'm trying to, reemphasize that we're not guaranteeing you that we're going to see a hurricane. Hopefully we don't, but in the case that there is one, it will more than likely be a much smaller storm in nature, especially since there will not be nearly as much of a troughing feature that elongates the wind field as well, similar to what we saw with the Fujiwara effect with Hurricane Helene. Now, the European model doesn't really have anything developing other than just some showers and some disorganized showers and thunderstorms in the Gulf of Mexico as we go into next week, and even then it has like a very brief low pressure center trying to develop, but not really anything of concern. Now, another thing is that will be concerning is if this does actually develop, this is going to possibly bring more rainfall to areas that do not need more rainfall, like areas like the Appalachian Mountains, for example, because if this does make landfall, let's say in the Big Bend or back over near, Mobile or something like that in Alabama, and it tracks to the north and northeast, it could get absorbed by an upper level trough that does kind of cut in here to the southeast, and that could bring more rain and moisture to areas in the Appalachian Mountains. So if we saw something like this happen, we could see an additional 1 to 5 inches of rain across areas like the Appalachian Mountains and then back through the Gulf Coast. Again, it is a very, long stretch at this point if this is actually going to happen because we don't yet have something that's developed in the Caribbean Sea, but definitely something that we need to pay attention to, I think, for this upcoming week. And for the rest of the Atlantic Ocean, we are going to be watching for the potential for a much more intense, I think, hurricane trying to develop during the week. As this develops, it'll eventually move off to the northwest and north. It is not expected to impact the United States, but that's the area of development that we currently have back over in the eastern Atlantic Ocean that has a very high likelihood of developing. Eventually, that'll continue to move north, possibly becoming a major hurricane, by the way. Again, not really going to be anything impacting the United States, but maybe sometime by like mid-October, that could be impacting areas like the United Kingdom or perhaps even Europe. So maybe something to watch for over there. For the next 48 hours, we're going to continue to see that broad area of low pressure bring some more additional rainfall to areas in the mid-Atlantic. Again, those areas don't need more rain, but that's going to continue. Elsewhere, things look very, very dry across the United States. So if you're looking forward to dry weather, I think it's going to continue because we're likely going to have a zonal weather pattern throughout this upcoming week, which will basically mean that we're not going to see any sort of low pressure systems really entering the United States that are going to bring any significant rainfall, aside from maybe that tropical cyclone that might develop later this week. We could see a bit more troughing by the weekend that could bring some cooler weather to areas like the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, but again, doesn't seem like anything too crazy at this point. So for the next few days, again, rain will continue in the East Coast, and then again, high pressure really dominating across the entire country by Wednesday into Thursday, and then by the weekend, again, it might become a little bit more active in the Northeast or the upper Midwest, and then also back in the Southeast. But aside from that, most of the country is likely to stay dry for the next week or so. So for now, that is all I have to talk about in the weather world. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're new here. We're going to continue to keep you posted on this upcoming possible situation, maybe a hurricane or tropical storm developing in the Caribbean Sea later this week. Hopefully it doesn't develop. Hopefully it's just quiet here as we go into early October, but I do have have a little sneaking suspicion that we're at least going to see something like a tropical depression or storm later this week. So again, if that happens, we'll keep you posted, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel and click the bell icon so you're notified with the latest video updates.